Picture this. Inland Laconia, the Peloponnese. A moonless night sometime in the early 5th century BC. A young man lies face down against the cold earth at the edge of a barley field. He has not moved in hours. His breathing is slow, controlled, deliberate. He is 18 years old, perhaps 19. He carries no armor, no shield, no food, only a short iron blade pressed against his forearm. He is waiting, not for a soldier, not for an enemy commander, not for fire and spy. He is waiting for a farmer to walk past. In about 4 minutes, I'm going to tell you what this young man's orders are. And when you hear them, when you understand what system created him and what it was designed to protect, every single thing you think you know about Leonidas and the 300 will collapse. Because the real story of Sparta is not about courage. It is about what you have to destroy inside a human being to make courage irrelevant. To understand the man who would stand at Thermopylae, you first need to understand what Sparta was standing on. Around the 8th century BC, Spartan armies marched west across the Tagetos mountain range and conquered a region called Messenia. The Messenians were not exterminated. They were not expelled. They were put to work. They became helots, a class of agricultural laborers bound permanently to the land, producing the grain, oil, and livestock that sustained every Spartan household. Their labor was the economic engine of the entire Spartan state. But here is the problem that Sparta never solved. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans. Ancient estimates vary. Some sources place the ratio at 7 helots for every single Spartan citizen. Others suggest the disproportion was even greater. The precise figure is contested. What is not contested is this. Sparta had enslaved a population many times its own size, and that population had not forgotten. The Messenians had been conquered. They had not consented. They had not assimilated. They had simply been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had been taken from them. In the 7th century BC, that moment arrived. The Second Messenian War nearly erased Sparta from history. The ancient sources describe a conflict so desperate and prolonged that Sparta teetered on the edge of collapse. The poet Tyrtaeus, who wrote during or immediately after that war, composed verse not to celebrate Spartan glory, but to urge soldiers not to break, not against a foreign power, but against the people who had been harvesting their crops since childhood. Sparta won. But winning did not reassure Sparta. It terrified them, because here was the arithmetic they could not escape. The entire civilization rested on the labor of a people who would burn it all down the moment they saw an opening. Every wall Sparta did not build, every fleet it did not sail, every trade route it did not pursue, all of that was a consequence of one decision that could never be undone. Sparta had made itself a prisoner of its own conquest, and so the entire society reorganized itself around a single obsession: control. Not growth, not trade, not philosophy or art or naval power. Control. How do you prevent a subjugated majority from ever again becoming a threat? The answer Sparta arrived at was total. It was methodical. And it was, by every modern measure, horrifying. At the age of 7, every Spartan boy born to a citizen family was taken from his home. Not metaphorically removed, not sent away to a good school. Physically taken from his mother and handed to the state. He entered a program called the Agoge, a Greek word that means something close to the upbringing. That translation is misleading. The Agoge was not an education. It was a conversion process. 13 years designed to transform a child into an instrument. The boys were divided into units, the ancient sources call agoli, a word that does not translate as squads or classes. It translates as herds. They were given 1 garment per year. 1. No sandals, no bedding. They slept on reeds. They harvested themselves from the riverbank, pulling the stalks with their bare hands because blades were not permitted. Food rations were calculated not to sustain the boys, but to keep them perpetually, deliberately hungry. Why? Because the boys were expected to steal. And this is where the training reveals its true purpose, a purpose most documentaries flatten into something that sounds almost admirable. If a boy stole food and succeeded, he ate. If he was caught, he was beaten. Not for stealing. The theft itself was never the issue. The punishment was for being detected. The Agoge was not teaching boys to forage. It was teaching boys that failure is pain and that pain must never be shown. Plutarch records a story about a Spartan boy who stole a fox cub and concealed it beneath his cloak. When approached by an adult, the boy stood motionless. The fox began tearing through his abdomen with its claws. The boy did not flinch, did not cry out. He stood upright until the animal had opened his stomach, and he died on his feet rather than surrender the secret of what he was hiding. Now, Plutarch himself acknowledges the story may be legendary. We cannot confirm it as literal fact. But here is what matters. The Spartans told each other this story as an ideal, as a model, as the kind of boy a Spartan boy should aspire to become. What does a culture reveal about itself by choosing that story as an aspiration? Not strength, not intelligence, not bravery in the conventional sense. What the Agoge prized above everything else was the absolute suppression of visible suffering, the ability to stand before another person, bleeding and dying, and give nothing away. As the boys aged, the training intensified. They were organized into competitive groups and set against each other in brawls with no rules and no adult intervention. These were not structured fights designed to teach technique. They were organized chaos specifically designed to identify something. Who keeps fighting when the pain crosses the threshold that makes every biological instinct say stop? At designated stages, boys were taken to the altar of Artemis Orthia and publicly flogged, not as punishment for any offense, as ritual. They were whipped until they bled, and the measure of success was silence. Pausanias, writing several centuries after the practice was established, records that some boys died during these floggings. Priests monitored the ceremony not by watching the boys, but by watching a wooden cult statue of Artemis. If the statue appeared to grow heavy, the flogging was considered complete. Foreign visitors traveled specifically to witness this ritual. By the time a Spartan boy emerged from the Agoge at age 18 or 20, he had spent more than a decade in a system that had accomplished something very deliberate. Not education, not even military training in the conventional sense, conditioning. The systematic elimination of everything inside a human being that might make him hesitate, question, or refuse. The Agoge produced men who could absorb catastrophic physical punishment without expression. Men who obeyed institutional authority without question. Men who could lock together in a phalanx formation for hours in brutal heat, 60 pounds of bronze on their bodies, and hold the line when the man directly beside them was skewered through the neck. This was the system that built Leonidas. He entered it at 7 years old. He left it without having made a single autonomous decision in his life. Every meal managed by the state. Every sleeping arrangement managed by the state. Every act of sanctioned violence managed by the state. The state had a single intended use for the men it created, and we are about to get to the part that almost never makes it into a documentary. Remember the young man in the field from the beginning of this video. Here is what his orders actually were. Each year, the Spartan authorities selected the most capable young men from the Agoge, those who had demonstrated excellence, and dispatched them into the countryside alone. No armor, no ration, only a blade. Their directive, as Plutarch records it with uncomfortable specificity, was to travel through Helot territory and kill any Helot who appeared physically strong, intellectually capable, or likely to command the respect of others. This program was called the Krypteia. The targets were not soldiers, not foreign agents, not men who had committed any act of rebellion. The targets were farmers, laborers, men whose only apparent offense was that they were capable enough to potentially become a problem. The Krypteia operatives hid during daylight hours and moved at night, selecting their targets. Men walking country roads, men returning from the fields, men who gathered in numbers large enough to suggest organization. This was not a rogue operation. It was state policy with a legal framework behind it. Each year, the Spartan ephors, the elected magistrates who governed alongside the kings, formally declared war on the Helots. Under Greek religious custom, killing during peacetime carried the risk of ritual pollution. The annual war declaration removed that obstacle. Any Helot killed during the Krypteia had been killed legally, within a declared state of war. And if that systematic detail alone is not disturbing enough, Thucydides records an incident during the Peloponnesian War that makes the underlying logic explicit. The Spartan authorities announced that Helots who had distinguished themselves in battle should step forward to be honored. Approximately 2,000 men responded. They were given garlands. They were escorted through the city, past the temples, in formal procession. And then they disappeared. All 2,000 of them. Thucydides states that no one could determine exactly how each was killed. 2,000 men, selected specifically because they had demonstrated valor, intelligence, and leadership, eliminated precisely because those qualities made them dangerous in a captive population. The Krypteia was the same logic applied as an annual systematic operation, not reactive, preventive. The state did not wait for a Hello uprising to materialize. It pruned, year after year, the individuals most capable of leading one. Now, hold this image in your mind. The men who stood at Thermopylae were not purely soldiers trained for external enemies. They were the graduates of a system built first and foremost for internal suppression. The obedience, the silence, the capacity to kill without hesitation or remorse. Those skills had been refined not on battlefield enemies but on unarmed farmers in the dark. That is the real foundation beneath the legend. In 480 BC, the Persian Empire moved. King Xerxes, son of Darius, who had been humiliated at Marathon a decade earlier, assembled a force that ancient sources describe in numbers that modern historians regard with skepticism. Herodotus claims more than 1 million soldiers. Credible modern estimates suggest somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000, still an operational mass that dwarfed anything Greece could directly oppose in open battle. Xerxes was not simply conquering territory. This was personal. His father's defeat at Marathon had produced a wound in Persian imperial prestige that demanded a specific remedy, the complete subjugation of Greece. The Greeks had warning. They had time. What they did not have was unity. The problem for Sparta was timing. The Carneia, a major Spartan religious festival, was underway. Spartan law was unambiguous on this point. Military campaigns could not be launched during the Carneia. This was not a guideline. It was a binding religious prohibition with no room for exception. And so Sparta sent 300 men. Not 300 because anyone believed 300 was sufficient to stop Persia. Not 300 as a symbol of courage or sacrifice. 300 because that was the ceiling Spartan religious law would permit without triggering a constitutional crisis. The 300 were not a dramatic choice. They were a bureaucratic compromise between military necessity and a calendar obligation. But Leonidas did not march with 300 men alone. When the Spartan force moved north, it was accompanied by approximately 7,000 soldiers from allied Greek states, Thespia, Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, and others. Farmers, craftsmen, citizens of small cities with no professional warrior class, no Agoge conditioning, no Krypteia behind them. Men who chose to march because they understood what a Persian victory would mean. The Spartans were a fraction of this coalition. The choice of Thermopylae was tactical, not theatrical. The pass, the Hot Gates, was a narrow coastal corridor running between the sea and the cliffs of Mount Calidromus. At its most constricted point, the path was barely wide enough for a single cart. In that geometry, the size of the Persian host became functionally irrelevant. The Persians could not deploy their numerical advantage in a space that allowed only a few dozen men to fight at any one time. The Greek phalanx, dense, armored, disciplined, was precisely designed for exactly this kind of close confinement. For 2 days, the math worked. Wave after wave of Persian infantry was fed into the pass and was repulsed. The Immortals, Xerxes' elite household guard, professionals who had never known defeat in the field, were sent forward on the second day and driven back like everyone else. Herodotus describes the Greeks rotating units in and out of the front line with practiced efficiency, the Spartans holding the most demanding shifts. The pass held, and then a man named Ephialtes walked into the Persian camp. He was a local, a man who knew these mountains. And he knew something that shifted everything. There was a trail. The Anapeia Path, a mountain route that wound through the ridges above the pass and emerged behind the Greek position. Leonidas knew the path existed. He had stationed a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers to guard it. But when the Persian immortals advanced along the trail in darkness, the Phocians fell back to higher ground to protect their own position rather than block the corridor. By dawn on the third day, Leonidas received the intelligence that would define how history remembered him. Persian forces had completed the encirclement. The pass that had been a fortress for 2 days had become a trap. What followed is the moment that 2.5 millennia of mythology have crystallized into a single image of heroic sacrifice. Leonidas sent the allied forces away. The specifics of that dismissal matter enormously. Herodotus gives us 2 accounts. In the first, Leonidas ordered the allies to withdraw in order to preserve their lives. In the second, the allies assessed the situation and chose to leave, and Leonidas did not prevent them. These 2 versions produce very different images of the same decision. What stayed behind was approximately 1,500 men, the 300 Spartans, 700 soldiers from Thespia who declined to leave, and roughly 400 Thebans whose presence Herodotus suggests was less than voluntary. About the Thespians, they deserve more than a footnote. These were not professional soldiers. Thespia was a modest city. Its 700 fighting men represented a substantial percentage of every male of military age the city possessed. They were not trained from childhood for this moment. They had not been hardened by a decade inside the Agoge. They understood exactly what remaining meant. They stayed anyway. No studio has made a film about the 700 Thespians. No motivational poster bears their names. They died in the same narrow pass, on the same morning, against the same enemy, and history has largely absorbed them as background to a story about 300 men from a city that specialized in making sure its people had no other options. But the reason anyone remained at all was military, not symbolic. The 7,000 departing allies needed time to put distance between themselves and the Persian cavalry. If the entire coalition withdrew simultaneously, the horsemen would ride them down across open ground before they reached safety. A rearguard had to absorb the final Persian push long enough to give the allied infantry a survivable head start. Leonidas assigned his Spartans to that role. Now here is the detail that rearranges everything you have been told about the selection of the 300. Every man in that force had a living son. Every single one of them had already produced an heir. This was not sentiment. It was not a philosophical gesture toward the legacy of fatherhood. It was the Spartan state performing a cold demographic calculation. Sparta's citizen population had been contracting for generations. A citizen who died without producing a male heir represented a permanent subtraction from the system. One fewer soldier in the next Agoge cohort, one fewer family sustaining the communal mess hall, one fewer phalanx position in the generation ahead. By selecting only men who had already fathered sons, Leonidas was not choosing heroes. He was choosing men whose deaths would cost the machine the minimum possible. The sons were already in the Agoge. The land would pass to the heirs. The pipeline would continue. The system would survive. Leonidas was not choosing heroes. He was choosing men whose death the system could afford. On the final morning, Leonidas moved the remaining force forward, out of the narrowest section of the pass into a wider stretch of the coastal plain. This decision is significant. The 2 previous days had been won by constriction, funneling the Persian numbers into a corridor too narrow to exploit. Moving forward meant abandoning that tactical advantage deliberately. It was not a mistake. It was a final objective shift, from holding the pass to inflicting maximum casualties on a broader front before the end. Herodotus describes what followed as different in character from the previous 2 days. The Greeks were not defending, they were attacking. They drove forward into Persian lines with a ferocity that Herodotus describes as exceeding everything that had come before. Spears shattered and were not replaced. The Greeks drew swords. Swords were lost or broken, and the men fought with fists, knees, and teeth. 2 of Xerxes' brothers, Abrocomes and Hyperanthes, were killed during this assault. The deaths of royal family members tells you what was being committed to this engagement from the Persian side. Xerxes had deployed his command structure into the fight. Then Leonidas fell. The exact manner of his death is not recorded. Herodotus tells us he fell fighting and then tells us what happened to his body. The Greeks and Persians fought over the corpse in 4 successive waves. 4 times the remaining Greeks drove the Persians back from the body of their king. 4 times Persian forces returned. In Greek military culture, the possession of a fallen commander's remains carried weight that went beyond honor. To surrender a king's body to the enemy was a failure that followed a city home. The Spartans understood this. They fought not from grief. They had been conditioned since childhood to suppress that, but because the system demanded it. Eventually, what remained of the Greek force retreated to the Kolonos hill, behind the old wall at the eastern end of the pass. The Thebans broke from the hill and moved toward the Persians with their hands raised, declaring they had been coerced into the fight. Herodotus says some were accepted as prisoners, others were killed, others were marked with the Persian royal brand. The Spartans and Thespians who remained on the Kolonos did not charge again. The Persians did not coast to finish them at close quarters. They stood at distance, archers, javelin throwers, soldiers hurling stones, and they worked methodically until everyone on that hill was dead. Herodotus does not describe the conclusion as glorious, he describes it as methodical. When Xerxes walked the field afterward and reached the body of Leonidas, he ordered the head removed and the corpse impaled on a stake. Herodotus notes that this was unusual. Persian kings traditionally honored foreign commanders who had fought with exceptional skill. Xerxes bred that custom for Leonidas specifically. What that tells us is not simply that Xerxes was angry, though he was, but that the 3-day stand had cost him something he had not factored into his calculation. In men, in time, in prestige, in the psychological messaging of an empire that expected to sweep through Greece like a tide. The casualty figures Herodotus provides, 20,000 Persian dead, are considered inflated by modern historians. But even the reduced estimates credible scholars accept suggest losses significant enough to constitute an operational shock to a force that had expected a morning's work. 40 years after Thermopylae, the Spartans recovered Leonidas's remains. They built a hero shrine. They held games in his name annually. At the pass, a memorial was raised with an inscription that has been quoted for 2,500 years. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Read those words carefully. Not we died for freedom. Not we fell for Greece. Not we gave our lives for our children. Obedient to their laws. That is what Sparta chose to inscribe on the memorial of its greatest military action. Not heroism, not sacrifice, compliance. 40 years after Thermopylae, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War and stood as the dominant power in Greece. And within a single generation, that dominance disintegrated. The cause was not military defeat in the conventional sense. The cause was arithmetic. Sparta's citizen population had been shrinking for decades. The system that required total military commitment from every adult male citizen also made it structurally impossible to grow or even maintain. The population needed to sustain that commitment. Land accumulated in the hands of fewer families. The number of men qualifying as full Spartan citizens declined with each generation. By 371 BC, when Sparta met the Theban army at Leuctra, it could field fewer than 1,000 full citizens as soldiers. The Theban general Epaminondas shattered them, and then he did the one thing that could not be undone. He led his army into Messenia and freed the Helots. The population Sparta had enslaved for more than 2 centuries, the people whose labor had made the Agoge possible, whose surplus had fed the warrior class, whose captivity had required the Krypteia and the annual declaration of war and the entire architecture of Spartan control, walked free. Sparta never rebuilt. Without the Helots, there was no agricultural surplus. Without the surplus, there was no full-time warrior class. Without the warrior class, there was no Agoge. Without the Agoge, there was nothing left of what Sparta had called itself. The thing that made Sparta legendary was the same thing that made Sparta impossible to sustain. Every year, people stand at the pass at Thermopylae and read those words carved in stone. They share quotes about Spartan shields and Spartan iron. They watch a movie where bronze men hold the line against impossible odds and call it freedom. But what we are actually looking at when we look at Sparta is the output of a machine that separated boys from their families at age 7, a machine that calibrated hunger as a training tool, a machine that sent teenagers into the darkness to kill farmers who had done nothing except exist in a way that suggested capability, a machine that declared legal war on its own labor force every single year without interruption, a machine that managed reproduction as a state resource and configured death as an acceptable logistical outcome. Leonidas stood in that past because 3 decades of systematic conditioning had made every alternative, surrender, retreat, negotiation, genuinely inconceivable. The system had not simply trained him. It had rebuilt the architecture of his decision-making from the inside. The 300 did not choose to hold Thermopylae the way a free man chooses. They held it because the Agoge had dismantled the part of the human mind that generates other options. And the 700 Thespians, the farmers and craftsmen from a small city who looked at the same situation, made the same calculation, and chose to die beside men who had no real choice, are the ones history swallowed whole, because their sacrifice was an act of genuine free will. And genuine free will is far harder to turn into a monument. The story of Thermopylae has been told for 2,500 years as a story about what free men will do when they choose to stand. But the men most celebrated in that story were the least free people in all of Greece. And we are still choosing not to sit with what that means. If this video made you think differently about a story you thought you already knew, That is exactly what this channel exists to do. Hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this content deserves a wider audience, and it genuinely helps us keep making videos like this. Subscribe to the History and Fact if you haven't already. Every week we go behind the myth, past the movie version, and into what history actually looked like when no one was polishing it. The next video is already in production, and I promise you, it is going to rearrange another story you thought you understood. Don't miss it.